Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together some of the best-known columnists on UK newspapers, BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, record-breaking daily increases in COVID infection hit the UK. Please, not lockdown, are the order of the day, though the public are already voting with their feet. And Boris Johnson's pleas were ignored by 100 of his own MPs and by voters in a previously loyal part of England. Is he now leader of the party and the country, only in name? Well, Henry Chu is long-serving foreign correspondent and deputy news editor at the LA Times. Polly Toynbee is a veteran columnist on the left of centre Guardian newspaper. And Simon Jack, the BBC's business editor, is here in the studio. Good to see you, Simon. Good to have you both joining us from parts around the UK while we maintain all our social distancing for just that little bit longer as a result of what's happening at the moment. Let's begin in Downing Street, who have been having a week they'd rather forget. Three things may explain why. A newspaper published a photo of a Christmas party last year held in the basement of Boris Johnson's party headquarters at a time when all such activities were against the law. The UK's leading civil servant, the Cabinet Secretary, was investigating gatherings inside Downing Street, one of them in the Prime Minister's own flat. At least he was. It turns out his office organised what it called a Christmas party too. On Tuesday, the imposition of COVID vaccine certificates, which have become a condition of entry to public venues, provoked the biggest rebellion of Boris Johnson's premiership. 100 MPs, that's half of all those Conservatives who aren't part of what's known as the payroll vote, like ministers, opposed him. On the most important question of the day and on his judgment of how to keep the public safe, it appears they don't trust him. Nor, if the result announced in the early hours of Friday morning in a parliamentary by-election, does some voters. Polly Toynbee, I can imagine them singing choruses, "That was the week that was, it's over, let it go," in Downing Street and indeed in Boris Johnson's flat. It rather sounded as if that was the Prime Minister's position as well, because he sort of said to Jones, well, look, there was a lot of stuff in the headlines, and that got in the way of the voters seeing what a tremendous job we're doing for them in doing things that are going to improve their lives. Were the voters blinded by the stuff people like you and other journalists have been putting in front of them?
Well, I think it's traditional that politicians blame the media for bad stories that they've created themselves. I mean, he has had one worst week after another for about the last 6 weeks, culminating in a catastrophic by-election yesterday. It would be hard to compile as many disasters as have struck him, and most of them are things that he himself has done. But he said, I take responsibility for the bad results and for growing unpopularity, but then he refused to actually take responsibility for anything in particular. But, one thing after another at a time of great hardship in this country, where the economy is, people are really feeling the pinch, where COVID is very threatening to everybody's way of life, and his own party is in absolute rebellion and some chaos, and his own party very much out of kilter with the public. The public are much more worried about being cautious about COVID restrictions. We have a party that's very libertarian and thinks any restriction is, they were comparing it to Stalin and Hitler, very, very modest regulations. So the party itself is somewhat out of control, not just Boris Johnson himself.
Henry, all prime ministers have difficult periods. Some are able to bring themselves back from those difficult periods, and after a few months or a couple of years, everybody has almost forgotten, because by the time of the next election, they've somehow got themselves back into public favour. I mean, even Margaret Thatcher had some very rough periods during her first 4 years as Prime Minister, and then won a stunning victory. But I suppose the difficulty here is that Boris Johnson is the great communicator. And if the great communicator can't get his message through, despite irritating people in the media, then that potentially is a problem, isn't it? That might cause them to change leader, although one Tory MP said to me earlier, well, he's probably got 6 months to kind of pull things round, because we don't want to do anything in haste, and we still hope he can do it. But there's a kind of practical question here, isn't there, that it might be that actually he is still their best option.
Well, first of all, I think that a prime minister who himself was a journalist as a livelihood before he became a political figure really doesn't have much to say in terms of criticizing journalists. So let me just say that that feels a little rich to begin with. But in terms of being the great communicator, it's no doubt that Boris Johnson has a particular kind of charm that really resonates with voters, that he's really more like a great cheerleader. And that was of great benefit back in the election campaign 2 years ago when Brexit was looming, and it was a great project that the country was embarking on and leaping into the unknown. And so here was Boris Johnson in his blustery bluff fashion, reassuring the electorate and telling everyone that great things lie ahead. Well, this is a little bit different. People voted for Brexit. They didn't vote for the pandemic. And this is something that he needs to manage much more effectively, I think, than has been the case. And the voters are beginning to see that, as well as these scandals of sleaze that we've talked about and that have been dominating the headlines, that have been own goals by this government. Now, you know, he needs to be able to communicate not just with the public, but with his own backbenchers and his own party leaders. And if he's not able to do that and show that he can pull everything together within a few months, I think he will be in danger. Changing a leader is very disruptive, but they're 2 years out still from the next election, a little bit more than 2 years. And so he has some time to do that because public memories can be short. But I don't think the party will necessarily be forgiving of him if the current electoral trends keep continuing with lost by-elections like this.
Simon, Ruth Davidson, who was the Conservative leader in Scotland, was on the radio on Friday saying one of the examples of what she thought was poor leadership was that speech we talked about on this programme a few weeks ago, the Peppa Pig speech when he was directing the Confederation of British Industry. Why is that kind of speech caused such bad feeling?
Well, I was there. I was standing not much further from him than you are.
So you were able
from me.
to look around at the audience.
I did look
round.
round. I have to be honest about it. I've seen quite a few Boris Johnson speeches to business. It's an audience he doesn't feel, unusually for a Conservative Prime Minister, that comfortable in front of. I think he finds their strictures, their spreadsheets and their analysis and all that kind of stuff a little bit sort of stifling. And sometimes, so like during the Brexit debate, he saw the caution of businesses who had real money on the line. He saw that a form of...
He saw, dare I say, the conservatism of business.
Well, he just thought he thought it was, you know, cautious at best, a form of cowardice at worst.
Oh, right, yes.
And also, I think he finds business people quite tedious, if I'm truly honest, having watched him in these scenarios.
Strange. In that sense, he's a bit like Ted Heath, who used to get very angry about British businessmen coming in to see him and just saying, well, we need a bit more money, we need a bit more of this, and not being very imaginative and creative, and in his view at least.
Yeah. Well, I mean, businesses like to be positive, but I wouldn't call them signing up to the kind of boosterism that some people accuse Boris Johnson of. So I was surprised, actually, if I'm honest. Probably a damning indictment of my journalistic instincts of how big a story that became on the day. I think it's now faded because, as I say, that was par for the course. I've seen him, you know, talk to a bunch of bankers and their partners in Davos in Switzerland when he was trying to persuade them not to go to Switzerland after the financial crisis, saying you couldn't do number 2 after midnight because you get reported to the authorities, and everyone roared with laughter, and it was all part of brand Boris Johnson. But I think on where the real stuff hit was around the Owen Paterson inquiry, which is why we've had the by-election.
Yes, it wouldn't be a by-election if he hadn't.
Well, I think his suspension would almost be over by now had it been played slightly differently. So I don't think that brand Boris in a way was damaged too much by the Peppa Pig thing. But I think a series of whatever Dominic Cummings, his former aide, would call the trolley going off or whatever, going off the road, or the car going off the road, has hit him. But the point is, on an economic basis, is the fact we had a number of things that have come along recently, which maybe we'll get to, which is that fact inflation is now rising faster than people's wages. That is a pretty toxic area for any politician in any country to be in, and it's not just happening in the UK; it's happening elsewhere. We should make that point. But when you're not getting on in life, when you're working as hard as you can, and actually prices are rising faster than you can afford to pay for them, then you begin to feel that you're not getting ahead. And I think that's one of the fundamental contracts that you make with the people, that if you do this, then your life will improve. And I think that is one of the things that people are seeing. Their energy bills go up, their petrol prices go up, and wages not going up in line with that. I think that is going to be the biggest issue of 2022 on my watch, which will be inflation, how high for how long.
Polly, that's another reason why the politics are going to get more difficult in the coming year, at least for Boris Johnson. I heard Ruth Davidson also in that interview say a bit of bloody grip, as she put it rather bluntly, and that seemed to reflect some of the exasperation that other Conservative have expressed. There will be some Tories, though, who see silver lining, who say, well, at the end of the day, it was won by the Liberal Democrats, who are probably not going to be the party that can hope to defeat us at the general election. That's Labour. Labour went from second place to third place. Therefore, it can't be as bad as some people are suggesting.
That's a serious misjudgment, because there has always been a majority against the Conservative Party, but it's been split between Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens and other parties. If you really are seeing, in a place like North Shropshire, which is very, very deeply and solidly Conservative, if you're willing to see people vote tactically to get the Conservatives out, so that Labour voters, who there were more of them at the last election than Liberal Democrat voters, are willing to lend their votes to the Liberal Democrats, whatever it takes to get a Conservative out, they're in real trouble because they have relied on that split. One of the most extraordinary things about this is that this was a very strongly pro-Brexit area, deeply rural and pro-Brexit. How extraordinary that they have voted for the most anti-Brexit party of all, the Liberal Democrats. It shows that Brexit is no longer a political issue in this country. That's what broke Labour apart at the last election. That's now over. It's finished. People think Brexit is done. They don't want to hear about it anymore. And Boris Johnson, some of Boris Johnson's mistakes has been to pick quarrels, particularly with the French, because he thinks it will revive his fortunes because he was the great get Brexit done man. Well, Brexit is done and people are fed up with it, and they don't want to have fights with Europe. They don't want fights with France, and they don't want fights with America protecting the Irish and trouble over the Irish border. So he's made so many miscalculations, but this is really going to change politics if Brexit is no longer really an issue.
Now, on that question of Brexit no longer being an issue, this Christmas, it doesn't really matter whether you've been naughty or nice, because Omicron is coming to town if it isn't already in your town. In the 24 hours to Friday of this week, 93,000 people were infected. Daily records have been broken all this week and will probably continue to be broken, as the rate at which people are becoming infected far exceeds anything seen in the pandemic so far. Now, Boris Johnson described the British government's response as a jabathon, giving people vaccine booster jabs to limit any effect this new, largely unknown variant of COVID will have. Maybe a milder infection than previous variants, but if the numbers infected are so much greater than before, then more people will end up in a hospital. And I suppose, Henry, in that sense, if you could give us a sense of already what impact this is having, and why, I suppose, in a sense, we're not starting from scratch here. We're starting in a situation where lots of other medical procedures have had to be put on hold over the last 21 months to deal with COVID. And now at the point perhaps when people were starting to feel that health service was able to get back into routine, some of it very important, some of it life-saving routine, it's kind of going to be forced back into a kind of reacting to COVID situation.
I'm just remembering a year ago now when also you had a new variant, that was the Kent variant that was discovered here in Britain, was galloping through the country, and the uncertainty that people felt. And now, just exactly 12 months later, we're having a bit of a rerun of that with Omicron. I think the scientists still are saying the jury is out. The data are trickling in places like South Africa where it was first detected. But here in Britain, the scientific advisors are saying it's not going to be until the end of the month and possibly well into January before we have a really strong picture as to whether Omicron, which does appear to be more transmissible, is actually less virulent. Now, as you said, if it's less virulent but is still attacking a larger base of people, that could still create great problems for the health service. And we'll have to see how that pans out. In the US, we're seeing that it's doubling every couple of days, which is much faster than Delta, but hospitalizations haven't gone up across the board. They've been bad in some places like Michigan or New York, and we've been seeing a lot more Omicron cases there. But I think we just need to approach this with the same kind of caution that we've approached the other variants. We don't know exactly how two regular doses of the vaccine will hold up. It seems like they don't hold up so well. So we do need to be going under the jabathon that Boris Johnson is promoting, and also just taking the cautions that we've now already become quite accustomed to and are of real no hardship to wear a mask in public, let's say, which is now mandatory once again in public spaces here in Britain and also in my home state of California. These are easy measures, and let's pull together to try to keep Omicron at bay as much as we can.
Polly, insofar as this debate has happened in this country, it was focused on that defeat this week over COVID vaccine certificates, which will come in anyway because the opposition parties largely supported the Prime Minister, even if many of his backbenchers did not. The Prime Minister says, we're not going to lock down Christmas. That we're not planning any lockdowns. In a sense, the public seem to be acting with their own, kind of voting with their feet, as I said in the introduction. They seem to have taken it on themselves to decide when it's good to take the risk and when not. I mean, that's quite an encouraging sign, isn't it?
I think it is. The people have been more sensible than this government right from the very beginning. Interesting that the Queen herself has started cancelling Christmas events. She doesn't want her family meeting together in too many numbers before Christmas. And that's what other people are doing all around the country. They are cancelling, to the great hardship of restaurants. They are cancelling office parties, family parties. I think there is a precautionary principle that the public understand about public health. If in doubt, we don't know how bad Omicron's really going to be, because it takes quite a few weeks before you really get mass hospitalizations, if that's what we're going to get. We're not there yet. They're much more cautious. I think there's a lot of trouble with the NHS. I mean, I've been covering the NHS for more decades than I like to count, and it has never been in such a fragile state. And it entered this crisis, this COVID crisis, having had a decade of its most stringent funding since it was founded in 1948. It had 100,000 medical vacancies. And then after Brexit, it lost a lot of staff. People went. Part of the idiocy of Brexit was to get rid of people we really needed working here. And there's now a waiting list of 6 million people. Well, back in 2010, when this government took over, there was virtually no waiting list. Before COVID, it had risen to over 4 million, and now it's risen to 6 million. And getting rid of that backlog, trying to catch up with people often in quite severe pain, waiting for hips or knees or sometimes more serious things, is going to be a solving it, because it requires doctors and nurses. One of the first things the government did 10 years ago was to cut back on training places for them. It takes about 10 years to train a doctor. So it's very difficult to find any kind of quick fix for this very serious problem.
Simon, that decision that people have made to cancel events themselves is starting to have a real impact, isn't it, in the hospitality sector, in particular restaurants and bars and theatres and all those other things. I mean, what is it possible to measure how much damage is being done right now, and to kind of have a clear sense of how important this time of the year is for this sector as compared to the rest of the year, which has not been great, let's face it.
Yeah, I mean, everyone was pinning their hopes on December. It, for some businesses, particularly in the hospitality, entertainment, retail, etc., make something like 30% of their profits in that 1 month alone. So it couldn't have happened at a worse time. We know that it doesn't really matter what the government says at the moment in terms of their policy. They will say, we're not going to give you any extra financial support. This is their current posture. Expect it to change. We're not going to give you any extra support because no one's shutting you down. We could walk out of here tonight, Sean, and we could go to the pub. It'll be quiet.
Yes.
And that is because the health messaging, consumer confidence, commuter numbers into our cities have evaporated in the face of this, just out of consumer choice. And that means that some businesses are facing financial ruin or a huge hit to their finances.
There'd be a paradox there, wouldn't there? If the government had helped businesses through the terrible first period of COVID and helped keep them going, and then they end up going under at a slightly later period, it almost feels like the money will have been wasted.
Well, there is that, and I think that there is an overarching point here which gets to a political point, which is Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, versus Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak has cut short a holiday business meeting, you decide which, in California to come back.
Not a Christmas party, just for the record.
Yeah, not a Christmas party, to come back to sort of sort this all out. Yeah. Now, fundamentally, Rishi Sunak's political brand is based on the fact that every time there's a problem with the economy, you can't reach out and use the Treasury as a backstop to sort of bail you out. He wants to have some fiscal rectitude. He wants to get public debt down. And there's a bit of tension between number 10, which basically thinks that they can throw money, I think, at many projects and they want to make things better and that, what have you. So there's that existing tension. So I think
throw even more money, aren't they?
Well, I think that tension is
trying to recover his reputation.
I think that tension is going to increase. I was just talking to some business groups who've been in with the Chancellor this afternoon, inflation. They want to see a return of VAT to emergency levels. They want business rates and other things deferred, and some more targeted grants. Yes. He said, listen, there's existing measures out there saying without new support, many will face ruin this Christmas. I think he's given himself enough room to do nothing on his rationale, but I'd be surprised if he doesn't do something.
Yeah, good. Just a quick question then, I guess, to each of you. Simon first, are you changing your Christmas plans because of Omicron?
I'm hanging on, hopefully, that one of the things I think that we haven't kind of factored in is that we'll be going about our business. Some people won't be changing their habits, but staff absences will, in certain things like the transport network, we've seen theatres closing shows. Yep. So if you're planning to go, as I am next week sometime, to go and see family members, I don't know where that train's going to run right now. I'm guessing that there's a high level of jeopardy that it won't. So I'm crossing my fingers. I'm boosted. I'm hanging in there. I'm hoping for the best. And I don't know how I can really prepare for the worst at this point.
Henry?
Yeah, I'm still keeping to my plan of seeing family on the holiday itself, but being more careful now about whom I'm seeing and the things I'm doing before that so that it doesn't jeopardize that plan. Now, unfortunately, for me, family members are coming in from the US and from Australia. And that's scary because you never know when travel restrictions will suddenly be imposed again on either side, whether they can get back in here or whether they can go back to the countries in which they live. So fingers crossed all around.
A relative maybe for life, well, for a few months, not just for Christmas. Polly?
Well, sadly, my French daughter-in-law, her lovely mother, was coming over and now she can't. And that's very sad. So she won't be joining us and she'll be all on her own with nobody to spend Christmas with. So, yes, plans have changed and things may well change again within the next week. We wait to see. It's quite likely that if the Omicron gallops ahead at the rate it is, that we'll all be suddenly told not to be meeting. Well, I've kept my tent up in the garden, where we were allowed to entertain people out of doors. So we might end up Christmas in the tent again with a few of us.
And I hope a bottle of something fizzy, I hope. Simon, let's move on to talk about the economy, because we're already talking about one of the things that may have an impact on the economy. Two really interesting statistics, you referred to them. Inflation up to slightly over 5%, and the Bank of England cutting interest rates.
Raising them.
Sorry, going the wrong. I've been listening to Recep Erdogan in Turkey. Inflation's going up, cut interest rates.
No, finally raising them. Long after, a month later than many people were expecting to do. Just to put it in context, we've had, I remember in 2009 when interest rates were cut to record lows, and we all thought, in a few months, in a couple of years, they'll be back to normal. Here we are 12 years later, and they were at 0.01%. So they put them up what they call 15 basis points. That's 0.15% up to 0.25. Still incredibly low. And I think a lot of people thought that, blimey, if 5.1%, if the highest inflation in a decade isn't an excuse for the teeniest little increase in interest rates up from 0.1 to 0.25, then what is? Of course, the Bank of England were expected to do it last month. They held off. And then the Omicron virus was, a lot of people thought they would hold off again. I think that they've got to, they've got to be seen to be in the price stability game, as the FT put it this morning, which is kind of their main job. What I would say, though...
What are they there for otherwise?
Well, but the point is, other people would say, what is this really going to change? And also, when it comes to inflation, this is a global phenomenon. And so you've got supply chain things that raising interest rates right now. Will it have any impact on inflation when you've got much bigger structural forces at work? Don't think so. I think it's a credibility building exercise rather than an effective measure.
Yeah, well, in the light of, if we're talking about credibility building exercise, perhaps we'll park Turkey's interesting experiment with economics going on right now. You can read a lot on BBC Online about that. Henry, Jerome Powell has only just stopped describing inflation as a sort of transitory problem, which seems to be a final acknowledgement of something Simon was suggesting. I mean, the worrying thing is that inflation, if it gets into the system, and we can't eliminate it because our limits in terms of the benefit these days of interest rates making a difference. The kind of tools are very limited, aren't they, for central banks or other financial bodies?
Well, there are some things that, for example, the Biden administration could do in the U.S., where inflation is even worse than here. Last month it nearly hit 7%, and it was the highest rise in about 40 years. But the problem with the tools that they have at their disposal are they're often jackhammers that create a cure that can be almost worse than the problem itself. I know some people are saying this inflationary period might peak around March or April, and you can maybe let it ride through. But the danger for politicians is that come election time, the electorate won't be so forgiving, and especially for a Democratic president. Those with memories of the Carter administration, now we're talking about the 80s, his presidency was limited to one term, largely because of inflation and rising gas prices at the pump.
No wonder.
That's a totemic, absolute totemic in American society. Doesn't matter what the NASDAQ is doing. Doesn't matter what the Dow Jones is doing. If it's costing you more to put in gas into your car, that's going to really impact how you cast your vote.
No wonder he's been letting some of the reserves of fuel out in the system. My thanks to Simon Jack, to Polly Toynbee and to Henry Chu. Just to say, next week, if you are stuck at home for Christmas, stay with Dateline. We'll be looking back at the year that's just gone. Goodbye.